Okay, today we're going to be looking at Song of Songs, chapter 3. It only has 11 verses, so we're going to do it all in one session here. And again, I just want to repeat, this is a summary. It's not a thorough study. It's designed primarily for those who are part of the Doulos retreat, in which we spent hours kind of going through this verse by verse. So at the end of chapter 2, there's sort of kind of a surprise. After the bridegroom, Jesus, has been calling his maiden, his bride, calling us to a life, come up to the mountains, uh, begin to enjoy and experience my resurrection power. It's a new way of life. And he talks about, in the clefts of the rock, in the secret place of the steep pathway, that's where I can see your form. I want to hear your voice. It's lovely. It's sweet. And all of a sudden, at the very end of the chapter, verse 17, it says, until the cool of the day, when the shadows flee away, turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of Bether. All of a sudden, she decides, I'm just not ready for this. And I don't think it's a lack of desire. I think it's more a lack of confidence. Maybe maybe there's fears. I mean, going up to the mountains. This is she's known her bridegroom as a shepherd, as a and now he's calling her to be like a gazelle on the mountains. So anyway, so we go to chapter 3, and it starts off. Let me just read the first few verses. On my bed, night after night, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but did not find him. I must arise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I must seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but did not find him. So what's happening? The maiden all of a sudden realized that he is gone. He took off without her, and he went to the mountains. She had hesitated, and now she regrets it. So, she said, night after night, I sought him, but I just couldn't find him. And so in verse 2, she says, I must arise now. She decides, okay, I'm going to arise. And she goes into the city, she goes into the streets, she goes into the squares, but she still does not find him. Now, one other thing we should probably kind of mention here is that 4 times in the first 4 verses, she refers to him as him whom my soul loves. And I think, our soul is that which includes our desires, our emotions, our dreams, our heart burdens. And in the Psalms, especially, our soul, it speaks of our soul being tormented, attacked, but it's also our soul that sings for joy and cries out to the Lord. And so one thing that this absence has done is just, if anything, it's just increasing her love for him. She misses him. She loves him. Her soul loves him. She has a desire for him. And I think that's what happens sometimes, is that sometimes, maybe because of our indecision, maybe it's because of disobedience, maybe sometimes it's our lack of faith, there's his presence. Of course, I know his presence is all with us, but our being able to kind of sense his presence is kind of gone, and it causes a greater craving inside of us. And I think that's exactly what is happening here. So in verse 2, she decides finally that she will arise, and something that she had been exhorted to do back in chapter 2. And she leaves her house. She, her comfort zone. She goes about in the city, in the streets and squares, but she still doesn't find him. Then in verse 3, the watchmen who make the rounds in the city found me, and I said, have you seen him whom my soul loves? And the watchman, I think I'm just going to, that does seem to refer to leaders, spiritual leaders, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But I think we'll talk more about this in chapter 5 because I think it, it we'll see a more complete picture. But anyway, she's asking, I need to find him whom my soul loves. Then in verse 4, scarcely had I left him when I found him whom my soul loves. The fourth time there. I held on to him and would not let him go until I had brought him to my mother's house and into the room of her who conceived me. She finds him whom her soul loves, and she holds on to him. She won't let him go, and she leads him back to the house. She misses him and desires that intimacy with him. And I think one thing we can kind of note here is the love and patience of her shepherd, of her gazelle that has for her. And I know that some people have kind of referred to this passage as, as something that kind of happens, it's part of the discipline of the Lord that we read about in Hebrews 12. And of course, what does it say in Hebrews 12? All those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. And it's for a purpose, right? That we get closer to him. But here it's interesting. He doesn't scold her. He doesn't, he's not upset at her, because just the absence, he guides her with gentleness, with patience, with love. And he allows us sometimes to have to kind of struggle through these, kind of wrestle through these things. And of course, one of the things we kind of mentioned at our retreat is that, Jacob, back in Genesis 32, he had that time where he wrestled with the Lord all night until he received that breakthrough. And sometimes God allows us just to have to wrestle through things because that wrestling process, it purifies us. It refines our motives. It clarifies our vision for him. It deepens our love for him. And that's what seems to be going on here. I think one thing, we've kind of already said this, but let's kind of repeat it, that one of the things she loves him, obviously, but she doesn't fully understand yet that his plan for her is to be with him, to actually be ministering with him, ministering in that resurrection power. He wants us to really abide in him, to be with him consistently. Sure, he desires and he wants to have those times of intimacy where we're just sitting at his feet, where we're under the apple tree, where we're in the chambers. But that's just the beginning. He also wants us to be his raya. Remember that word darling means companion, my co-worker. Actually, I've even heard some people kind of translate it as my equal. And I'm not so sure it kind of says it quite that strong, but still the implication, I want you as my co-worker. And I think that's what he is trying to lead her to. And he's leading her a step by step. And as she comes to the realization herself that that's what I want. That's what I want. Yes, I'm kind of scared of the mountains. I'm kind of scared of, this unknown territory. But I love you so much that I'm going to go. And so we see Jesus leading her step by step. Okay, in verse 5, we have a repeat of what we saw in chapter 2, verse 7. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you will not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases. And again, this is the, kind of a chorus, or you could say maybe it's the Holy Spirit speaking. And once again, we'll say it again, we appear to be instructed and exhorted here not to arouse or awaken his love until she pleases. He knows that we often take time to process things and come to full obedience or to full faith. And therefore, he's patient with us. Now, um, um, sometimes we're not as patient with others, are we? It would have been easy for us to go to that maiden, take her aside and kind of speak to her about her lack of trust, about her lack of faith. Why didn't she go with him? Doesn't she realize what she's missing out by not going with him? But that doesn't seem to be kind of happening here. Rather, there's kind of a gentle leading step by step. And I think we need to kind of learn to embrace this exhortation and trust God to bring about his work in each of us. Philippians 1:6. I'm not sure if I think I mentioned this last chapter too, but let me say it again. It says, Paul's writing here, he says, "For I am confident of this very thing." I like that word, confident, "that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus." In other words, Jesus started a good work with us, all those who are truly born again, and he realizes that, all the maybe garbage and baggage and, the prior life that we kind of came out of, we're coming out of a world of dysfunction and darkness and hopelessness. And so he leads us into his path, and he does it with gentleness. Now that doesn't mean that there's not occasional rebuke, and certainly there's the discipline of the Lord. Like this seems kind of harsh right here, where all of a sudden he just kind of leaves her. He kind of goes on without her. And again, we're not saying that we know that especially in the new covenant, he's always with us, but that sense of his presence seemed to have lifted, and it was harder. And she had to search for him. She had to seek him. And she, and that God uses that seeking and searching to work inside of us. Okay, so now let's go to verse 6, and the scene changes, and we hear the chorus, and it says, "What is this coming up from the wilderness?" And actually, that word "what" is the same word. It could also be translated, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness?" I kind of prefer that, especially in the context of everything. Now, some people have kind of suggested, is this a vision that she sees? Because she is the one kind of telling it. It's not the bridegroom, um, you know, um, speaking, or it's maybe the chorus singing it, saying this, and so maybe it is something that she sees. It really doesn't really matter, but you will kind of hear different people say different things. But it is a picture of Jesus coming out from the wilderness. And it says, like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all scented powders of the merchant. Behold, it is the traveling couch of Solomon, which is a type of Jesus. 60 mighty men around it, of the mighty men of Israel. Okay, let's just kind of stop right here. And it says, here he is. He's coming out of the wilderness, which I think suggests, his time of wandering around in this world. But he's coming out of it. She gets a glimpse, and here he's coming as a king. She's seen him as a shepherd, she's seen him as a gazelle, and now she sees him as a king. And we could kind of see a few other things that she sees him as we kind of go through the book. And but it says, "Who is this coming coming up from the wilderness like columns of smoke?" What does that refer to? Well, I think that's obviously referring to his glory, because many times in the scriptures, when it talks about his glory, it's talking about, it kind of refers to the smoke or the cloud. Let's just kind of look at a couple verses. We'll probably talk more about this in our Doulos meetings, here this summer, but let's just kind of take a quick look at this. like in Exodus chapter 40, for example, after the tabernacle has been completely finished, built, everything's been anointed, it says in verse 34 and 35, it says, oops, wrong chapter here. It says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle so much that Moses couldn't even go into it. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. First Kings would be another example. Chapter 8, verse 9 and 10. Maybe verse 10. It says, it happened that when the priest came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Or in Revelation chapter 15, verse 8, it talks about, and the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. Or Isaiah chapter 6, we see it again. You know, it seems like a lot of times when it talks about the, the very presence of God, when it talks about his glory, there's smoke around it. Isaiah 6, maybe I'll just kind of start verse 1. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. Obviously, this is a vision. Lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. And he talks about, he sees the seraphim and then verse 3 it says, and they called out one to another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So God's glory is all around the throne here. And the foundations of the threshold trembled at the voice of him who called out, while the temple was filling with smoke. So, and we could probably look at about 10 other places where it talked, probably even more than that, where it refers to, like here in the Song of Song, who is this coming up from the mountain? Like columns of smoke. In other words, it's the glory of God. And then it says, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense. We've already kind of talked about that, but that's an obvious reference to what Jesus did at the Calvary. You know, at Calvary, he has been resurrected. You know, frankincense, worship, with all scented powders of the merchant. Behold, it is the traveling couch of Solomon. And, the traveling couch of Solomon, you know, um, you know, this is the place, he's Solomon's coming out, and it says that it's surrounded by what? It says 60 mighty men around it, of the mighty men of Israel. All of them are wielders of the sword, experts in war. Each man has his sword at his side, guarding against the terrors of the night. Now, who are these mighty men? Who are these that are around it? We're not told exactly. They very well could be angelic beings, because we know that angelic beings, angels, often came with swords. They are sent out, according to Hebrews chapter 1, to minister to the saints. They protect us. There's probably a lot of things we don't realize in the heavenlies where there's angelic activity. In fact, remember the time that Elisha was with his servant, and his servant was kind of worried because the armies were surrounding the city, and Elisha asked for the servant's eyes to be open, and what did he see? He saw a myriad of angels all around with swords, and that gave him comfort. Well, yeah, they may look, the the army of the enemies look kind of bad, but they don't look anything is ferocious and as strong as the Lord of hosts with all his angelic beings. So this could just be kind of a glimpse of this. And obviously one of the things that the maiden was worried about, one of the reasons why she didn't go up, because she was there were some fears. What happens? What if I fall? What happens about this? What about wild animals, wild beasts? And I think in this vision of her seeing Jesus, her lover, coming as a king with 60 mighty men around it, the mighty men of Israel, all of them with swords, and they're experts in war, that there is a protection. In fact, you can read Psalm 91. That's a psalm comforting us that what? That 1,000 may fall on one side and 10,000 on another, but what? God's going to protect us. And in fact, it kind of talks about, the angels, there. So I think this very well could be angelic activity. It doesn't really make any difference how. We just know that Jesus has all power, and here we see him not just as a caring shepherd, not as a gazelle or a young stag climbing on the mountains and leaping on the hills. Now we see him as king in all majesty, in all glory, with the columns of smoke. The king is in his resurrected glory. There's a lot of things we could kind of keep talking about, but let's jump down to verse 9. King Solomon has made for himself a sedan chair from the timber of Lebanon. Okay, so the sedan seat speaks of the king seated in a place of rest and rulership. And we know from many of the scriptures in the New Testament that today Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father, ready to make his enemies a footstool under his feet. That's not said once, but it's said half a dozen times in the New Testament. And yet it's kind of interesting, the sedan chair is also mobile, which tells us that the king is still on the move, gaining ground over the enemy. And again, there's a lot of verses we could probably talk more about this, but I think the picture here is that that Jesus he's made for himself a sedan chair. He is seated, and yes, he's victorious. He's a gazelle, but at the same time, he's seated on the throne. It says he made for himself a sedan chair from the timber of Lebanon. We'll talk more about that in chapter 4, because this whole thing about Lebanon and the significance of that is important, but we'll see it a little bit later. Verse 10, he made its post, speaking of the sedan chair, of silver, its back of gold, and its seat of purple fabric, with the interior lovingly fitted out by the daughters of Jerusalem. Okay, we've already kind of talked a little bit about how gold represents divine, perfection, complete purity. Silver speaks of redemption. Purple fabric, purple is in the scriptures, and really even outside the scriptures, is kind of the royal color, speaking of his kingship, because he has been crowned and he has been declared King of Kings, right? And then it says, with its interior lovingly fitted out by the daughters of Jerusalem. And this is one of those phrases that just doesn't translate very well, but the picture here is that the interior has been, because of the love of the daughters of Jerusalem, because of the love of his people, the people whom he died for, it has prepared for him a place, a throne room, really, is what he's saying. And then verse 11, it says, go forth, O daughters of Zion, I like that. Go forth. In other words, it kind of has this same sense as we saw in chapter 2 about arise, my darling, my beautiful, and come along. Here he's saying, go forth and gaze on King Solomon with the crown with which his mother has crowned him on the day of his wedding and on the day of his gladness of heart. In other words, Jesus is, you know, his vision for for this maiden, for the church, is to be his bride, you know, to be married to them, where he's a companion, where where they serve together and work together on his purposes here on earth and really throughout all of eternity. Hebrews 1:9, and you can kind of look at this a little bit later, it says that Jesus has been anointed with the oil of gladness. In fact, that kind of comes from Psalm 45, which we said kind of is a parallel passage to this song, where it talks about on the day of his wedding it's Psalm 45 talks about this oil of gladness before it talks about the myrrh and the aloe, you know, which we've already kind of referenced before, you know, but you know, this oil of gladness, that, you know, that Jesus is glad, he is excited, he is full of rejoicing about his bride. It's not a case where he's kind of thinking that, you know, oh no, I guess, you know, his bride, she's so mixed up, but I guess I'm kind of called to love her, kind of like Hosea was, to the woman that God told him to marry. No, there's a gladness in his heart. He is excited, and he's got a crown, and he is king, and he wants us to be there with him. Let's just kind of look at Psalm 45 real quickly before we end this chapter. There's a lot of things. Verse 4, and in your majesty ride on victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. You know, again, he's riding in his sedan, chair. You know, he's moving. You know, it talks about verse 6, your throne, O God, is forever, ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. And this is what, Hebrews refers to. And all your garments are fragrant with myrrh and aloe. Oh, exact same thing. And cassia. Out of ivory palaces, stringed instruments have made you glad. In other words, there's celebration, there's rejoicing, there's singing, and this whole chapter, refers to the king getting married, and verse 19, they will be led forth with gladness and rejoicing. They will enter into the king's palace. So this is Psalm 45 is definitely picks up on some of the same wording, language, imagery that we see here in the Song of Songs. Okay, so that's kind of a brief summary of chapter 3, and we'll kind of pick this up in chapter 4. Thanks a lot.